We're going to jump right into our next session. So if I may, I'd like to introduce the moderator for our next session, Dr. Nasir. Thanks so much for being here, president of the Spencer Foundation. I'd like to have our speakers come to the stage. In this session, we also have Sammy Koijo. Where are we? Where's Erin and Oh, our speaker's already here. Well, that's easy enough for me. Nayla, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So pleased to move to the next session. I know that people have been sitting for a while, so we won't be offended if you need to get up, stretch, get coffee, or use the restroom. This session is focused on the responsible use of AI and challenges, opportunities, ethical dilemmas. So we're going to get into the ethics of this. So this last panel gave us a really good sense of some of the learning that's at stake, some of the amazing science that's happening to support technologies that support learning, how we understand what kids are doing in those amazing little helmets. And this session, we're going to get into, should we put those little helmets on, kids? No. we're going to be talking about broader issues around how we think about fairness, responsibility, ethics, and I'm going to throw in there equity, because we can get into that a little bit too. I know you all on the panel are up for that. So we're going to start. We'll each do 5 minutes. I'm a timing type of a person, so I'm going to put a timer on. You'll get a little ding at your 5 minutes, and then we'll get into a little bit of collective conversation, starting with you, Rob.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm going to go over here. I don't have any slides. That's in part because I come from the philosophy department in political science. I'm a political philosopher. Philosophers like to work at 35,000 feet. I'm more comfortable with trying to pose good questions worth answering, rather than just a solution-oriented thing to whatever question happens to be on the table. I'll bring you 3 general points, but I want to share briefly my perspective. I was originally an elementary school teacher before going to graduate school, found my way into political philosophy. Philosophers, if they have any social value, they're meant to be productive irritants, and so I'm going to be a Socratic mechanism of engagement with you here. I heard reference before, the kind of temptation on any panel to say at the end of the session, well, I'm an optimist at the end of the day. The healthy skepticism that you heard in the last panel, I want to combine the two. The philosophical posture I invite all of you to sort of orient yourself around with respect to AI education is optimism of the will, skepticism of the mind. Bring all of our enthusiasm to building and designing things worth building and designing, and use your brain to understand why they might nevertheless fail. As a philosopher, I've been working in the computer science department in the AI lab and now the Institute for Human-Centered AI for the past 5 or 7 years, just by way of saying something perhaps unnecessary to this crowd, but why I come in philosophically as a productive irritant. I'd been a happy professor for 10, 15 years on campus in the political science department in the early 2010s. I noticed the department beginning to empty out of the undergraduate majors because everyone was voting with their feet to come over to this part of the campus and major in computer science. That was understandable, even if a little disappointing for me as a humanist and social scientist. But then I had an experience in office hours with a student who came to visit me, a freshman, so he was only on campus in the fall quarter for 5 or 6 weeks. He said to me in office hours, I am so pumped to be at Stanford University. This is the place to build the AI future. I can't wait to take the classes in venture capital, the classes about AI, deep learning, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, professor, I have some startup ideas. And I said, great, maybe you should take some other classes around campus. You're just arrived here, it's a big university. And in the meantime, just to be friendly to him, 17, 18-year-old kid, I said, well, what are your startup ideas? And he looked me dead in the eye with total sincerity and said, well, professor, I'd be happy to tell you, but first I have to ask you to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And I said, something is wrong on campus. Time for an effort at a cultural intervention over on this part of the campus. And I began working on AI governance. I just have returned. I spent the past 10 months working in the United States government at the US AI Safety Institute. My last day was the day before the inauguration. All right, so I've got 3 points I want to make to you in 4 minutes. I want to give you first a macro perspective with the healthy skepticism that was invited. 2 points here. Number 1, I do believe that AI is going to be a transformative technology. Genuinely, that's the case. GPT, a generative pre-trained transformer. That's the generative models that we all talk about these days. GPT also stands for a general purpose technology, something that transforms things across society, things akin to the introduction of the internet, electricity, the steam engine. It's not just a sector-specific thing. Yes, it's going to be transformative. And if you study the history of education reform, of school reform, you know that the grammar of schooling, the organizational structure of schooling in the United States is extremely durable and sticky. On this particular campus, about 10 or 15 years ago, we had MOOC mania, massive online education courses, and it was going to wipe higher education off the map, creative destruction within the next 10 years. Sebastian Thrun had taken the red pill. He was ready to resign from the university and start the MOOC mania. Well, 10 years later, we see there's some interesting things, but I don't see education wiped off the map, massively, radically transformed. A teacher I had in graduate school, a historian of education who wrote a fantastic book called Tinkering Toward Utopia. The tinkering bit there is important, small incremental changes over time, said that the last innovation in American public schooling to go completely to scale and to endure was the introduction of the chalkboard about 100 years ago. We should have a healthy skepticism anytime a tech bro shows up and says, I have a startup idea and it's going to massively transform education in the next 3 or 5 years. Public schools will not look like they do now because everything is going to change. All right, that's the macro perspective number one. And yet, AI is going to be transformative. So the question is then, at a different type of macro perspective, how is it that the builders of AI, the computer scientists, the AI ML developers think about their task? If you look at the history of computer science education, training, and development, there's this long-standing debate between what often gets called automation versus augmentation. Are we trying to replace human beings and substitute for their skills and intelligence? Or are we trying to cultivate and facilitate their skills, interests, and abilities? Overall, I would say that the augmentation bit is diminished in status, and the automation part is what gets venture capitalists and more generally AI ML developers excited. And befitting a philosopher, I think that it's a bad question. In other words, think about what I think is, for those of you who are CS people, the kind of orienting question over the past 75 years, 50 years for computer science education, starting in the first year classes that you take here on campus. The Turing test. How can you get a machine to mimic a human being? Can you get a machine to successfully deceive a human being? The Chinese room version of the kind of test or experiment you just heard before. The Turing test has been the lodestar of computer science for about 50 or 60 years. It invites computer scientists from the day they begin their education to think about how they can build a machine that can substitute for human beings. That's a bad question. What would the world be like if instead we had the orienting question for AI developers being, how can you develop a machine that can help coordinate the activity of human beings, to facilitate the development of their talents and skills, and to augment their overall abilities? The world would be a different place, I think. So part of what I want to invite you to think about as we think about education is this augmentation versus automation debate, and look for innovations that are on the augmentation and facilitation side rather than the automation side. Third and final point. I think a less familiar debate in the history of education, rather than automation versus augmentation, is an essential one for thinking about AI in education, which is that we have to think about the difference between a child who gets AI and an adult who gets AI. You've probably by now heard the view that if you're already an adult working in the workforce, that maybe you're less likely to be replaced by a machine, but if you don't learn how to use AI, you will be replaced by someone, a human being who knows how to use AI in the workplace. That's fine as a way to think about this, but the essential part for me is to think about, from a design perspective, how is it that a child differs from an adult? When we use generative AI and get a result, if you already had developed the skills to assess the value of the result, you're in a good position then to deploy it and use it as you wish. But if you're a 10-year-old who hasn't yet developed the skills to assess the output, it is a temptation to view that as the thing that you want itself. Just last week, you may have seen a study that came out that said those who have higher use of generative AI in the workplace are using less of their critical thinking abilities in the workplace. You outsource the critical thinking to the machine, and at best, you use your critical thinking abilities for information verification and task management rather than critical thinking itself. So I view this as basically a design challenge. So when people come in and say, oh, AI is just going to be like a calculator, there'll be a little bit of a moral panic for a little while amongst math educators and parents about replacing the talent of doing math. I think that's a bad analogy. I think AI is not like a calculator. If AI is going to be agentic, I don't see the calculator acting as an agent. I don't see a calculator as a general purpose, generally intelligent type of orientation. We should not accept that analogy. We should instead think that the key function, not just automation and augmentation, but adult and child. When we're deploying AI in a school, we have to think about the facilitation and cultivation of talent rather than the mature judgment of an adult human being who can assess the output of an AI and incorporate it into their work or life. That will mean different things for builders, designers, and people who are integrating AI into schooling with the work of teachers and students. Thanks for tolerating my provocations today.
Thank you so much. Sammy, we're going to turn to you.
Okay, so I have to follow Rob. Every time this has happened, it doesn't go well for me. In any case, thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be here. I like to write notes. I'm less off the cuff than Rob is. I hope you'll indulge me in reading through some of prepared notes I had to start off this conversation. So I lead a group here at Stanford, which we call the Stanford Trustworthy AI Research Lab, that has a vision to help close trust and safety gaps in artificial intelligence on the foundational side, but then thinking about ways to evaluate and mitigate failures of AI systems in various use cases. And we've thought about it in areas like healthcare. Increasingly, we're thinking about these in areas like education, thinking about questions like fairness, robustness, privacy, with the goal of trying to get AI systems to work better for everybody. I think throughout the conference, there's a lot of conversation about AI revolutionizing education, I think, much to Rob's point. From, I think, exciting things like personalizing learning experiences, I think interesting applications to helping teachers maximize delivery of material at scale. I think all these are exciting, but for sure, I think some of what we're learning are some of the gaps in AI systems and where these gaps can lead to failure if we don't think about navigating them correctly. So a couple of thoughts I wanted to share with the group. So one, we've been thinking a lot about what fairness and equity means. And AI systems broadly, but specifically, I think increasingly interesting in the education area. And so we have a recent paper that's also a HI blog post that we call Fairness Through Difference Awareness, where our main goal, if you look at the AI and machine learning literature, think about fairness, is mostly posed as a sort of equality kind of framing. And I think misses sometimes how we can get better fairness outcomes by being more contextual. So in education, for instance, accounting and acknowledging for differences between groups, we think, is essential for real equitable outcomes. You could imagine a tutoring system that thinks about students from different backgrounds. If one thinks about this as sort of a colorblind system, for instance, if you're worried about issues related to demographics, race, for instance, treating all systems identically may actually make or perpetuate disparities, make them worse, by failing to account for variations in, say, cultural context, learning styles, education opportunities. And so we think true fairness actually requires knowing these differences and thinking about how to build algorithmic systems that account for them appropriately and think about delivering tools appropriately within these differences. Another thing to mention, my frame has changed quite a bit. I was here, I think it was a year ago. Was it a year ago? I think we were at a panel together. Yes. And there, I think a lot of the thinking was mostly about bringing AI tools to education. I think for sure this conference is about this as well. But one, I think, new frame that I've really anchored on over the past year is actually, I think education has a ton to learn. Sorry, AI has a lot to learn from education. And so I'm actually quite excited about bringing some of the thinking in education to improving the way we build AI systems. In particular, think about AI evaluation. So thinking about, for instance, methods from assessment and various ways of sort of measuring student outcomes, and to what extent they can be used for building things like better benchmarks and better evaluation tools within AI specifically. So we've been working quite a bit on a lot of these ideas. We've been thinking about questions like better defining constructs within AI, for instance. So thinking about what the goals of actually building AI systems are, thinking beyond, does it matter that an AI tool is good at some abstract algebraic thing versus how well is it connected to sort of meaningful use cases? Does that abstract algebraic thing say something about intelligence in any kind of meaningful, measurable way? Or is it really, I don't know, gymnastics on sort of abstract tasks that has no real world relevance? And so we've been trying to build on a lot of thinking education to better frame these questions of measurement within AI systems evaluation itself. We're using item response theory tools for those of you in education. So we're sort of thinking about how we can expand these tools to help us do much, much better AI assessment. I mentioned briefly construct validity, thinking about sort of measuring what matters rather than convenience, which I think a lot of the hill climbing in AI has been built around. So what's easy to measure as opposed to what actually matters in terms of building better systems. And so I'm very excited about this cross-disciplinary exchange. How I think both of us have been over time. Rob was better about ignoring the prompt than yes, it was. In any case, I'll mention a couple other things. So I've also done some work thinking about policy. I guess now you're
I'm trying to be a poker face.
Okay. So I'll mention a couple of the papers. There's a paper we wrote recently thinking about shaping AI's impact on billions of lives, where we try to think through a bunch of different areas where AI might matter, education being one of them, others including things like healthcare. I mentioned this as maybe a place to go look at where we think there are sort of near-term opportunities, and in particular, places to create moonshots that I think are better framed than, again, the abstract notion that often pervades the way people are building AI tools now, that are much more likely, we think, to lead to productive uses in, for instance, educational outcomes. And they're, again, really excited about various ways the stakeholder involvement. So to Rob's point, thinking about the teacher's perspective, thinking about parents, thinking about all the different stakeholders that might mean, that in terms of what it might mean to deploy useful AI in education, and sort of bringing those to bear and better framing the questions and better framing what our sort of targets are for building the systems. So I think last I'll just briefly mention, there are lots of tensions in the way we build technology. I think it always is true that we have to examine our values and think about trade-offs when we're building these systems. I think our learnings from many areas, but increasingly machine learning and policy, highlight tensions and aspects tied to, for instance, fairness, privacy, capability. And so, for example, perfect privacy protection might limit personalization, impact performance, and this may have disproportionate impact on various groups. I don't think these tensions are exceptions. They're actually deeply inherent in what it means to build technology, all the way from just how we pick our problems and what we want to try to solve, to how we measure what progress looks like. Our values will end up shaping what it means to build technology, and in particular here, building AI tools. And I think it's a mistake to pretend that these tensions don't exist. So I think it's much more productive to acknowledge them and think about frameworks that allow them to navigate them thoughtfully. So I'll end with saying, I think I'm excited about the future of AI in education. I think I'll see in this panel if I'm the most excited. But I do think it does matter what decisions we make. And I think there's still time to make good decisions in how we build these systems. I think we can learn a lot from mistakes that have been made in other technological systems that have led to inequitable and fragile systems that don't work productively across different subsets of the population. And I think there are ways that we can think about these questions such that we can positively impact education for all learners. And so I'm excited about thinking about difference awareness and better framing equity questions, think about learning across disciplines, the crosstalk between education systems and the AI discipline, keeping humans at the center, navigating value tensions deliberately, and thinking about how to build these AI systems such that they can truly enhance educational opportunities for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Erin, and so the one non-academic has slides.
Yes.
Upside down world.
Can you believe it?
Handing it over to you.
And for those of you who know me, you know that's very unusual. So how many of you remember when you were little, you played this game, which one is not like the other? Yeah, welcome to the panel. Which one is not like the other? So I'm Erin Mote. I'm with the EdSafe AI Alliance. And I first want to just start off by acknowledging Jim Larimore, who's one of the founders of the EdSafe AI Alliance, who's sitting right here. Please give Jim a round of applause. Yeah, so I also want to acknowledge my dinner companions from last night, because I went back to my very secret hotel that I don't tell anyone where I stay because I love it so much. And they had me thinking. Has anyone ever been to a dinner like that where you're just thinking and thinking? And so I redid my slides last night at like midnight. And one of the things we talked about last night is, what do we want the future to be? So on one side, we have AI replacing humans, right? Replacing the teacher. And on the other side, we have actually what I want as a mom for my kids. A teacher leaning in, connecting, having the human relationship at the center. So the question is, take a moment, what do you want for the future of AI? So, Matt, where are you? Are you in the room? Okay, Matt and I were talking about this last night. And actually, Roy, I think, is also in the room. So we were talking about the reduction of suicidal ideation from Replica. How many of you know Replica? Okay, so you form a relationship, and we see young people forming relationships with chatbots, right? And it's great. In some cases, we are reducing suicidal ideation of young people. And it's by about 3 percentage points. And then we think about this cafeteria worker and research from the CDC. And the reduction of suicidal ideation for young people in this country when they have one meaningful human connection with an adult. And that's not by 3 points. That's by 33%. One meaningful connection with an adult. What's the future you want? And how are we going to get there? We're bewitched by AI tools right now in our sector. If chatbots are our penultimate use case, we're in trouble. But that seems to be all that we're building right now. For teachers, for students. That's a miss. And the reality is, most teachers aren't actually using AI yet. And guess what? We're late. So we have work to do. So at EdSafe AI, we lead work across the world with a framework that Jim helped develop called the EdSafe framework. You're going to hear a little bit about it in the wild later from Tara from New York City. But it's really prefaced around these 4 dimensions. Safety, right? That's privacy, security, not doing harm. And let me tell you, in every country I work in, every policymaker I talk to, every parent and community I speak with, what is their number 1 concern? It's privacy. Is my child's data safe? What is happening with my child's data? And in great school districts like Linwood, that's what the CIO and the CTO are asking on behalf of families. It's about accountability. Whose job is it to protect students? How should we be thinking about that? The EU is trying to push at an answer right now, right? How are we thinking about that in the United States and across the world? Fairness, transparency. Every AI tool in education right now has bias. It's just the way it is. There is no tool that doesn't have bias. So how do we think about some of the things you're talking about, Sammy, like reweighting? How do we design tools not to think about, oh, this tool doesn't have any bias, but to mitigate it? To design with an intentionality for those who are least among us. We need good data to do that. And it's really important that I acknowledge the least well-developed part of our ecosystem right now, the least well-developed thing we are doing together is actually answering questions for educators about efficacy. What works for whom and under what conditions? So, and I promised Niley I would stay on time.
You all did, so I take as much time as the gentleman did.
Okay. So, efficacy. Your researchers, your developers, your inquisitive grad students and students, undergrads. Are you going to be at the table? It would be really important for me to acknowledge right now that in this room and in this community, there are a number of folks in education research who are experiencing a level of pain and suffering. We are watching our public infrastructure cripple around data. And yet, my question for you is when we think about the ask right now of our current administration, our current policymakers, they're asking about national security and AI. They're asking about competitiveness. But they're also asking about what would it take for a human to flourish. Are you going to answer them? If you want to, click this QR code by March 15th. I'm not joking. This is the NSF call. Are you going to be at the table? Are we going to determine what this future looks like or not? Thank you. Got it.
Thank you, Erin.
There's
Thank
no
you all.
stairs on that side, y'all.
And you did it in heels. One more round of applause for our wonderful panelists. So I want to get into it a little bit, and I appreciate you all raised some really interesting and important issues across the talks. I think I want to start with this. So we're talking about fairness and values and equity and mitigating against bias and mitigating against harm. In that terrain and in the present moment that you named for us, Erin, what are the questions that we are not asking, that we might be afraid to ask, but that we should really be asking?
Go ahead.
I thought it was addressed at you.
Oh, no, it's addressed at everyone.
To everybody?
Yeah.
Please.
Okay. Well, I already made reference to the Turing test, and for many people, especially those who are actually trying to integrate AI model systems into education, it's an exceedingly abstract question. But as I tried to suggest before, unless we choose worthy questions to try to work on in the first place, we will end up with less than wonderful solutions. Although, of course, it's a natural question to ask. At the end of the last panel, the question was, what human skill do you think will remain in the future that is dominated by AI? And my response to that is, bad question. If that's how we are thinking about the design and deployment of AI in education, we're going to get a dysfunctional dystopian future in which AI is replacing and substituting and automating humans. Instead, the question that I think is worth asking from the beginning, which is to say the beginning of CS education all the way through the design deployment process into education is, how can we find things that amplify human intelligence, coordinate human behavior, cultivate, as you had on the final slide, what it would mean to live a flourishing human life? A venture capitalist I once spoke to said the following to me, and this illustrates this. So I'll leave this as the question we should be asking. If you have investment capital to put into AI in education now, this venture capitalist said to me, there are three kinds of things that people are trying to fund and build. Number one is replacement for human beings. So it's as if you were funding, back in the old industrial age, looms to remove human workers from the workplace and create more productivity and efficiency. The second thing you could fund is something like calculators. It doesn't remove human beings from the process, but it makes the human being more efficient, productive at their work. But the third thing you could try to fund is what he called a construction crane. Things that allow humans to build and do things that they couldn't do without the technology itself. And venture capital is way overinvested in assigning capital to looms, the equivalent of looms, and way underinvested in assigning it to cranes. So the question I want to ask is, where can we point to all kinds of grassroots efforts that incorporate multi-stakeholders from across the process, all the stuff that Sanmi and Erin suggested about getting parents, teachers, educators, community members into the design process itself, that are the equivalent of cranes rather than looms?
Yeah, thank you. Beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's inevitable that we have to help young people think about how to navigate what we don't know yet. And I founded a school in Brooklyn. And one of the things about running a school in the middle of downtown Brooklyn as it's gentrifying is neighborhoods change and schools change and who has wealth changes and institutions change. And so how do you help young people navigate those pivot points? And so I was always and am still really inspired by the work of John Seely Brown, who has said to us, how do we help our young people who aren't on steamships or sailboats like generations before, where you largely charted the course and stayed on it? But how do you help them navigate as whitewater kayakers? The skills about reading the current, the rocks you cannot see. And so what are we doing for those young people? What are we doing in our learning systems and design? What are we doing in learning sciences to actually build resilience and the ability to pivot? Because if there's anything I'm certain, as a mom of 2 kids under the age of 10, gosh, are they going to have even way more pivots than I did?
Anything you want to
Yeah. So one direction that resonates with me recently, and maybe it's a bit more critical to the field, but I think important for people thinking about using AI tools, is that on one hand, our field is, AI as a field is extremely good at getting at targets once they've been defined. So, some notion of good outcome. We're extremely good at hill climbing on some notion of improving some performance in something. On the other hand, we have this tendency to have this slippage of the usage of words. So words often don't mean anything, actually, for many folks within the field. In the sense of reasoning, intelligence, these become targets, but targets in a vague and underspecified way, such that from outside, sometimes people get excited about, say, I want to use AI because it has the word AI in it and it's saying something about intelligence. But again, often these mean quite abstract things that don't actually anchor to what you might care about in various kinds of use cases. I think our field has done a disservice because we slip into this so easily, and giving very lofty names to actually quite specific things that are quite far from what people think we're giving them when we promise various kinds of outcomes. I think there's a lot of space for, again, to this question of stakeholders to help set better targets such that the field can engage more productively. I do think, again, the superpower of the self-computing and AI field is really this: once there are well-defined targets, say data and things like that, improving well-specified outcomes. But when we get specified those outcomes, I think we can do that quite badly, and that can lead to, I think, significant overconfidence and capabilities and usefulness that's sort of not well calibrated.
Yeah, super, super important. I appreciate the way that all of you are kind of centering the people and the values and the learning and young people in how you're thinking about this. So I'm a newcomer to this AI space. I'm a learning scientist, and I think a lot about equity. So I have a question because I've noticed something. When I'm around folks who are talking about AI futures and technology and education, it feels like there are at least two types of people. There are people who are deeply steeped in understandings of equity and bias and systemic bias and the bias of technology systems, and they say, this is terrible. This is going to reproduce bias at rates we can't even imagine, and we're moving too fast, and we just really need to stop. And then there are the enthusiasts who say, this is amazing. This is going to amplify the capacity. This is going to lead to personalized learning. So I'm guessing, I'm not going to ask who's right, because I imagine the truth is always somewhere in the middle. But I guess I'll ask, how can we hold both of those perspectives as we think about developing tools, getting tools into education systems, and thinking about the ethics at stake? What does it look like to hold both?
To hold both in mind, I think you have to hold two different counterfactuals or baselines that you're comparing whatever the AI future is to. So baseline number one would be the existing array of imperfect systems and human decision making that are also riddled with various forms of bias and discrimination. And is it possible to design systems that are in some form or fashion better to that existing alternative? That's the baseline number one. But baseline number two is some other more ideal arrangement that will allow us not simply to praise AI because it somehow improves upon ordinary human decision-making or existing systems, but still allows us to identify from an evaluative standpoint of some ideal how AI might still fall short, or more likely introduce different kinds of bias and discrimination or amplify other kinds of problems that we weren't wholly aware of before. So yes, it can be an improvement. We should not blind ourselves to that. That's the initial counterfactual. But let's not forget about thinking more ideally in order to continue to evaluate the novel kinds of problems that AI will almost certainly introduce.
I think maybe a slightly different way of framing, I fully agree with the discussion so far. But one thing that has resonated with me in thinking about bias and equity and fairness questions in the field, which I think could be productive if harnessed appropriately, is that humans actually have a very particular bias when looking for things like equity and fairness gaps. Now, for sure, this is not everybody, and I think part of the work is education. Sorry, I'm using bias in two different ways at the same time. I'll expand on this in a second. I think it's important that we're thinking about gaps, and I think when we miss this and are over-enthusiastic, for sure, we end up in trouble. But what I found is many of the reasons that AI systems are biased come from existing biases and data sets that come from human decision-making bias. And so it's, again, this cycle almost, and it then sort of cycles and repeats itself. Engaging with the bias of human decision makers is often quite hard because I think people don't think about it as system issues, they think about it as personal, individual attacks, and that's challenging. I've found that people are much more willing to engage in bias in algorithmic systems, technological systems, and sort of ask hard questions. Now, of course, this is not perfect, but I would say, to first order, I've found people much more willing to interrogate when we see gaps in technological systems than in, say, human decision-making processes. And so I guess at the risk of being optimistic about your question, I do think this is an opportunity, the fact that we think about these things so differently and are much more willing to sometimes ask these hard questions when algorithm systems are at play and decision-making at scale. I think for sure the issue is the scale. So again, being able to make decisions that affect so many more people. But I think the opportunity here is potential for auditability, that we can actually ask questions in all these systems if we're looking at it in a way that can be much, much more difficult when it's humans and human systems. And so that's maybe a potential positive down this road.
I'm going to go in a different direction. And I'm going to go in the direction of what would we need to actually authentically mitigate bias in these systems right now. And I believe, and for many of you who have known me a long time, I'm going to say words like interoperability and security. And I'm going to say the words public infrastructure. Because right now, and this is why I am so deeply concerned about what is happening right now with the shutting down of data systems from the census to the Department of Justice to the Institute of Education Sciences. And it is why I am frightened that the things that we most need in this moment to meet the moment of national competitiveness, economic security, and human flourishing are disappearing before our eyes. And that's because no tool right now in our education space, if you put voluntary commitments from the EU forward or the voluntary commitments of the previous administration, could anyone say that they're meeting those voluntary commitments? Because they're training their systems on, frankly, just their own data. And that is really, really dangerous. And those industry leaders from these companies would tell you the exact same thing. So if they, for reasons of regulatory undergirding, and I could go on and on, I know you guys didn't think you were going to hear the words regulatory undergirding on a panel today at Stanford, but you did, check that off. We need to invest in the safety institutes. We need to invest in a set of public infrastructure. And we need to do it in education like our colleagues have done it in health. And there, because they have, for example, invested in diagnostic data of rare diseases or diagnostic data for subgroups, like sickle cell, for example, the diagnostic result of ER doctors, because they've done reweighting, because they've paid attention to subgroup data, because they have nationally represented data and public infrastructure, the tools are better, the outcomes are better, and frankly, I trust an ER doctor more. And so if we're going to think about safety and trust, we need to be thinking about public infrastructure and those data sets. And we need to be thinking, frankly, about the diversity, the equity, the inclusion of subgroups, and the accessibility of those data sets. So I'm going to say all the words together and not be afraid. Because actually, that's the thing that will continue to make sure that we lead the world in innovation.
Right, thank you. I want to end with just a quick round to ask each of you, and you kind of started us off in this direction.
Well, I'm
Erin.
so glad. I like to fire start, you know?
What is the future you want for AI?
So my son, Robert, some of you know Robert, some of you have known Robert a long time. He's dyslexic and dysgraphic. And so it's hard for him in school for his brilliance to be recognized. It is. He struggles to be able to get his brilliance out on paper, right? Or to be able to read at grade level. And he's so brilliant, y'all. And so my hope is for my Robert, and also my Claire, but for my Robert, that AI can help people understand that designing for the widest use case possible, that unlocking opportunity for students and subgroups is actually the thing we need to be doing to get to human flourishing. And I believe it's possible. I watched Robert use AI to just build a presentation about large mammals with big hearts. And it was amazing. And his peers saw him, and his teacher saw him, and he was safe, and he was known, and he was loved. And that was possible because he could express his brilliance with AI.
I'm going to stick with the theme. I would love to see a future in which AI enables what I believe is at the heart of an educational setting, a caring relationship between a teacher and a student. And something that allows for machines to insert themselves alongside to help build a caring, motivating relationship. Show me AI that's capable of motivating someone in the first place rather than just allowing a self-motivated learner to go deep. Show me an AI that builds a caring relationship. Show me an AI that allows people to express the full humanity that they possess in the classroom rather than a substitution, rather than a mere automation of a process.
Extremely well said. I'll maybe synthesize, because I think I agree with all the framing so far. I'd like to see AI that works, and I think working here means working in a way that actually matters for us, as opposed to, again, abstract ways that we think about what working might mean. AI that works in a way that supports and augments us as humans, and so working with technology, and AI that works for everybody.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking this amazing panel.